Indeed, I think I'm going to present the first view of the two views that Clemens described quickly. We'll see at the end of your meeting whether my view or the opposite view dominates, but I'm going to do my best to argue my case. So I'm going to share the slides. I'm assuming that you can now see them. I'm going to make them bigger. Good. Okay, so indeed, the topic is going to be fiscal policy on the low rates. And the background is that I'm actually finishing a book on that topic, and this is kind of a cliff note to give you a sense of what I'm going to argue. So the fact is that the decline in real interest rates has started quite a while back. It started with disinflation in the mid-80s, and then even as inflation became much lower, continued steadily until today. So this is really a long-lasting evolution. And this evolution has two important implications for fiscal policy. The first one is what is known as secular stagnation, which is not a word that I like very much, but has become standard. And the way to think about it is, and this is going to be a central concept in my presentation, think of the safe, neutral, real rate, which I'm going to call R star. This is basically the rate which is consistent with aggregate demand being sufficiently strong that output is at potential. So the rate that we would like to have at any point in time. Then secular stagnation is basically the statement that R star is less than the rate which is consistent with full employment, if you want, is less than growth. And this now has been the case for quite a while. Substantial implications for fiscal policy, which I will argue. The second is something which happens when the neutral rate is even lower, and it's the zero or effective lower bound, which is a remark that you cannot decrease the nominal rate far below zero. We used to think it was zero, we now know it can go a bit below, but basically this is the lower limit on the nominal rate, which gives an implication given expected inflation, the lower limit on the interest rate. The implication of this is that when the neutral rate becomes so low as to be lower than this bound, then monetary policy cannot help anymore. It cannot decrease the policy rate sufficiently to achieve R equal to R star. These are very different implications, but they often combine. Today, we are in an environment in which actually both are binding. And what I'm going to argue is that really forces us to think about fiscal and monetary policy quite differently. So I'm going to focus on fiscal policy, given the topic of the conference, and I'm going to take three issues. The first one is the obvious starting point, which is, well, what is going to happen to interest rates in the future? As Clemens said, if interest rates were to jump up tomorrow morning, then much of my presentation would be irrelevant. So how likely are we to face secular stagnation or this even stronger condition, which is zero lower bound? And I will argue that we are very likely to face the first and often the second. Having done this, then the question is, okay, so how do we think about debt sustainability in the current environment? Is there a level of debt which is unacceptable? And if so, what is it? And then the last part will be, well, okay, subject to this debt sustainability constraint, how should we conduct fiscal policy in this environment? So let me jump and first talk about interest rates now and in the future. So this graph, to me, is probably the most important graph of the presentation. What it does is compute 10-year real rates. So it takes 10-year nominal rates on government bonds and uses a forecast of inflation over the next 10 years and then constructs the real rates. And it does it for Japan in yellow, which I hope you can see, and in red for the US and blue for Europe. And what I want to get from the picture is the notion that this has been a steady trend. And indeed, if I had started in 1985 rather than 1992, it would look even stronger. But I think the 1985, 1992 is due to disinflation, to basically rates, being high at the beginning because of the disinflation and then coming down. So I think it's a bit misleading. I've decided to use the period where inflation has been fairly stable, starting 1992. And you can see it's fairly smooth. It's common to all three countries. So either common factors or enough financial market integration that they move together. But I think some of the two. And then the thing that you cannot see, and I think that's significant, that if you didn't know the dates, you would not know when the global financial crisis or the COVID crisis happened. It is clearly not due to that. They played a role for some time, but it's clearly something else which is going on, which is deeper than that. Now, I could show you many more graphs, but I've been puzzled and fascinated by this graph, which has been constructed by somebody called Schmelzing, who is at Harvard, who has constructed a series for the safe rate, safe real rate, going back to basically Venice, 1325. So you have nearly 8 centuries of so it's not always the same. Initially, it's the rate at which the Venetians could borrow, and then it changes for time. But what is very striking is that there has been a decrease in the real safe rate over time, clearly with ups and downs. Now, what we've seen in the last 20 years or 30 years is a much steeper decrease than before. But that tells us, if we think really long run, there are these underlying factors which are at play, and maybe they are stronger in the last 30 years. Yeah, very, very strong. So this is a graph showing the first of the two implications, which is some people have said, oh, but interest rates have decreased, but so has growth. And the answer is no. Growth has decreased a little bit, underlying potential growth, but interest rates have decreased much more. So the blue line is the 10-year forecast of US real growth since 1992 again, and you can see it has gone up a bit and down a bit, but not much action. And then the red line is the line you saw on the previous graph, and it is far below. So R has been less than G since 2000, with a reversal last year because of COVID, but now a very large R minus G. T is of the order of 6%, and R is of the order of minus 4%. So a gigantic gap in the last 2 years, not misleading, but you can again see the trend. The question is, where does this come from, these low safe rates? And they can come from two things. They can come from the fact that the marginal product of capital has decreased. So more saving, less investment. That would be kind of a real side. Or it could be that the premium for safety has increased, that people really want much safer. There's a higher demand for safe assets. So this is a graph which gives you a peek at what may be going. I think saving and investment have played a big role. I think that there has been an increase in potential saving, and that has played a role. But it's clear also that there has been an increased demand for safety. What I've done here is very rough. It's plot the expected rate of return on stocks of the S&P 500, computed as using the extended so-called golden formula, which is the dividend price ratio, plus the forecast of growth of dividends over the next 10 years. That's the red line. And then the blue line is what was the red line on the previous graph. I should have used the same color. And you can see that basically there hasn't been much decrease in the expected rate of return on stocks. There has been some, but not very much, about 2%. There has been a much larger decrease in the safe rate. So we have, when we're thinking about what's going on, it's both a combination of saving and investment factors and increased demand for riskless, safe, liquid assets. Last piece of evidence in this part is to actually look at what investors expect. And fortunately, at least in the US and the European and the UK bond markets, you have sufficiently many options that you can actually compute probabilities that investors give to some events. So here, I have to find a way of moving the picture so I see my finger to the right. I don't see it, but you see it. So I think, let me just look at my notes. So I can't quite see it on the screen. So take the last column, the 4% column, and look, for example, at Euro 5 years, so the second line. The number is 99%. This means that investors, in the way they price the options and they price the bonds, give only a 1% probability to the fact that the nominal rate will be more than 4% in 5 years. This is an interesting number because I think your guess for nominal growth is about 4%. So the probability that investors give to a reversal of R minus G, or you can do it in nominal terms, I minus nominal G, is 1%. So the investors are extremely convinced that this R minus G negative period is going to continue. We cannot, as we know, we cannot trust investors, but there's clearly some information. So this is a summary of what I would like you to take from this first part, which is there has been a very long downward trend. This was Schmelzing slide. So it's not a fluke. There are things happening. I think what happens fundamentally is that as income has increased, both within countries and across countries, longevity has increased, saving has increased. Poor countries, poor people do not save. As they become richer, they start saving. And then liquidity has also increased, making the safe assets more attractive. I think these are the two factors which explain 7 centuries. And I think they have been kind of intensified in the last 30 years. So in terms of the crucial issue, which is what's going to happen, I think that the fundamentals which I showed you suggest it's going to continue. It's not going to turn around right away. There might be bumps, and I'm going to mention one which I think is important. We'll discuss it later when I discuss fiscal policy. The stimulus program of the Biden administration, I think, has been excessive in size and may well force the Fed to actually intervene to prevent inflation. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the US you had a temporary increase in rates in order to stabilize the economy, stabilize inflation, which makes R greater than G for some time. So in the next few years, I can see an episode like this, but over the long run, I just don't see it. Now, in terms of designing fiscal policy, are we absolutely sure that R starts at less than G? No, we're not. I would say I would be a bit more pessimistic than investors. There's a 95% probability that for the next 10 years, this condition holds, but there's a 5% probability that it doesn't. We have to be ready to do whatever it takes if and when this happens. How likely is it that the zero-dollar bond will die? And I think we're going to get out of it fairly soon, but it will. I think that it will not be strictly binding for long periods of time, or once in a while. But even if it's not strictly binding, even if the interest rate, nominal interest rate is positive, the room for monetary policy to work is very limited when the nominal rate is 1 or 2%. It can only decrease the real rate by 1 or 2%, which is very limited. So I think these two factors determine how we should be thinking about fiscal. So let me move to debt sustainability, which is the second topic. Okay, so to state the obvious, the levels of debt are very high. Clemens mentioned them. So you have on the one side, say Mr. Schauble, who says we really have to decrease them, and then you have Paul Krugman who says no, this is a great time to borrow because of the rate ways. If we have good things to do, we should do them. Now, how should we be thinking about this? And this is, a major issue, both conceptually and in the reform of the EU rules. I think what we learned is that there is no magic number, whether it's 60% or 100% for danger. Japan is kind of the ultimate example. Net debt is 170%, gross debt is 260%. And the investors are willing to lend at 10 years at negative nominal rate, very negative real rate. So it's fairly clear that it cannot be just a debt number. I think we all accept it now. And sustainable debt is very different. If you have to pay 10% on your debt, or you have to pay 1% or 0%. So the first thing is to look at the dynamics of the debt to GDP ratio and then see what this implies. So I've written the equation that you probably all know. D is the debt to GDP ratio, and it depends on lagged debt to GDP. And the coefficient is 1 plus R over 1 plus G. R makes debt increase faster, G makes the denominator increase faster. The result is that the right coefficient is 1 plus R over 1 plus G. That's the accumulation part, but in addition, you have the primary balance, which moves that, and S is the ratio of primary balance to GDP. So if you want to stabilize that, and we can take this as sustainability, definition of sustainability, can we stabilize it? So you put D is equal to D minus 1, D large period, and that gives you the primary balance, which is needed to stabilize that. So in the traditional textbook, R minus G is greater than 0. And so if you have that today, you have to have primary surpluses in the future, or starting now, in order to stabilize that, which means you have to increase taxes or decrease spending, and that is seen as costly, and it is costly. But when R minus G is negative, and potentially quite negative, then you can actually stabilize that with primary deficits. You can run a primary deficit of some size and stabilize that. So it's a very different type of dynamics, and basically the coefficient goes from above 1 to below 1. And I'm going to state the implications on the certainty in very strong ways, and then the next slide will give all the caveats. Okay, so the first one is what I've said, which is you can run a primary deficit and keep the debt ratio constant. So if you take where we are today, you take a country at 100% debt to GDP, R minus G is minus 3%, not 3%, then you can run a primary deficit of 3% and not worry. Stronger proposition, suppose you run a primary deficit which is even higher than 3%. What will happen? Well, debt will not explode. That comes from the fact that the coefficient is less than 1. It will increase, but it will not explode. So in a world of R minus G negative, debt doesn't explode. It can increase. So for example, if starting from the previous example, you increase the primary deficit by 1%, so from 3% to 4%, then that will increase to 150%. It will not explode. It's not necessarily great, but it's not an explosion. But then there's maybe the most striking result, which is that start from a situation in which that is stabilized and then have a larger primary deficit for 1 year. So spend more, cut taxes, and then do nothing, never raise taxes again. Well, then the economy will actually go back to the same level of debt over time. It will initially increase and then slowly go back to the same level, and you will never have to raise taxes. So, the proposition that if there is debt, there is higher taxes in the future, just falls down the drain when R is less than G. You may actually never have to raise taxes. So, if you look at this and say, well, R minus G is going to be negative for a very long time, this means that there is really an enormous amount of room to play. So is there infinite final fiscal space? And the answer is no, for two reasons, which are fundamental. The first one is on the generating, which is that R star, assuming that R is set at R star is not independent of policy. So if you start using the fiscal space, then you're going to increase aggregate demand, which means that the usual rate is going to increase. So there's a limit. At some point, if you're too aggressive, R minus G is going to change sign, and then the dynamics are very different. So, but it takes a lot, when you actually go to the numbers, it takes a lot to get there. I think a more relevant issue is, well, this is, we were assuming that things were certain, but they are not. And the probability that become greater than G, as I've said, is small, but it is positive, and we have to take this into account. So, given uncertainty, that sustainability is a probabilistic statement. This is the effect of waking up too early. And so I think we have to use a definition which recognizes that. So my practical definition would be, in thinking about, what the EU has to put in place, what is the probability that over, say, the next 5-10 years, the country cannot generate a primary surplus as sufficient to cover interest payments, R minus G times D. So it's not interest payments like how they're usually defined, which is nominal rate times debt. The right definition is R minus G times D. If you go back to the equation, if S can cover that, then that will be stabilized. And if the probability is small or nearly zero, then that is sustainable. And I think that's the way that we should be thinking about that sustainability and that. So, says that sustainability, my own sense is that we have to answer the questions in 2 steps. So the first thing to do when looking at a country is to say, under existing policies, what's going to happen to that in the future, say over the next 5 or 10 years. I think going beyond that creates just too much uncertainty. And that's going to depend not just on the first moment, like most likely R minus G, but on the second moment. Clearly, there's uncertainty about R minus G. It's going to move. It's going to depend on implicit liabilities. It's going to depend on the path of a primary deficit, both the first moment and the second moment for the same reason, which is, well, it could be that, we plan to have small primary deficits, but they could be bigger if something happens. You do this under existing policies, and then you see, do you have a problem? If you look 5 years out, 10 years out, is the distribution of that such that there's some probability that that is increasing very fast at the end? If so, then you need to do something. And so this is the second step. If an adjustment is needed, can it be done? How can it be done? And I think that basically this is an exercise which is different for the government and for investors. So for the government, basically it's announcing a set of contingent policies or actual policies so that that is stable at the end of the horizon. That's going to, this is going to convince or not. And so I think for the investors, they'll have to say, well, these promises that the government is making are very credible. Is the tax rate very high already? In which case, I'm not sure that they can really increase it. Is the government in a position to do it? So the political aspect, is it a coalition government, which makes it harder? If it's a single party or somebody with charisma, like in Italy today, maybe it works better, but it's not just the current government, it's future government. And then something which is quite important is the maturity of that. If you worry that interest rates are going to move, that's really the main source of uncertainty in this context. Then governments can protect themselves by having their own maturity back. And if something happens to the short-term interest rate, then this gives governments, even if it's permanent, it gives time for the governments to actually adjust. If you need to increase your primary balance by 2 or 3%, if you have to do it in a year, it's very hard. If you have 10 years, because you have 10-year maturity debt, it's much easier. So I've argued that that was the way to do it. And the tool for this is known as stochastic debt sustainability analysis. I've argued in Brussels that that's the way to go, but I'm probably not going to be to convince, and we're going to go back to some rules. But it's going to be very hard to have rules which come close to mimicking this complex exercise and start then they are likely to be costly. Conclusions on the issue of, okay, should we really decrease debt today because it's very high? And would this help with that sustainability? And my answer is basically fiscal austerity, which would be needed, leads to slow declines in debt, say from 100% to 90% over a few years, if you're really doing it very aggressively. And that's not going to make much difference because whether you have 100% or 90% debt, and the interest rate increases by, say, 500 basis points, then your interest payments are going to increase nearly the same, 10% less, but 10% of a large number. So it's not going to make a big difference. And I give a numerical example here. What works much better is to say, well, as long as R minus G is negative, we can afford primary deficits, but we have to have some credible contingent plan in which if R minus G was to become less negative or positive, we would adjust the primary surplus. So it has to be there in place. And if this happens, then it really cuts the tails of the distribution and it, basically makes that sustainability much more credible today than a long period of fiscal austerity. So I think that's what we have to be thinking about. Given the time, I'm going to just go through the slides. This slide in full, but just mention that an argument that has been given is, well, what if investors suddenly worry and ask for large spread on your debt? Well, in this case, if you have a lot of debt, you're in trouble. Now, can you avoid this? I just argued that realistically, you cannot decrease debt to a level which would avoid the issue. So it has to be even more of central banks to basically decrease the spreads. And I think that you have to distinguish between two cases. So the first thing is you can have, as we know, we've seen it in emerging markets, but I think we saw it in the global financial crisis. You can have multiple equilibria. Things are good, but investors suddenly worry about something. They decide that it's not good, the others do the same, and you get another equilibrium with a large spread, which in turn makes that sustainability questionable. And so the question is, can central banks basically avoid these sudden large increase in spreads? And the answer, I think, depends on the source of the increase in the spread. If it's just sunspot equilibrium, that investors got scared, but there was really no reason, then I think the central bank can play the role of a large, stable investor and come in and eliminate the equilibrium. I think can do it. If the risk reflects true fear of default by investors, then I think the central bank has a harder time, because what the central bank is doing, in effect, is buying bonds, but it's not an outside investor, it's part of a government. And in order to buy bonds, it issues central bank reserves which pay interest. So in effect, the liabilities of the government are not changed very much. And so if you're worried about default, which is the probability that the consolidated government is in trouble, then it's not clear that operations like QE, for example, are going to work. I think that's an issue to think about. So let me turn to the last part of the keynote, which is, okay, so we've seen that there is fiscal space in effect. I've shown that, but if you follow the logic of what I've said, it's not because you have 100% debt to GDP that there is no space. There is space, you have to be careful. So you can use it. Now the question is whether you should use it or not. And so that depends on the welfare cost of benefits of fiscal policy. So let me start with the welfare costs. So here I have to jump into what used to be theory, but now is still theory, but is very relevant, which is can it be that economies are over-accumulating capital and that the interest rate is actually a signal of that, in which case actually that is not so bad. So let me go through the arguments as they have been made over time. So there's a literature which basically looked at that case under certainty. So the interest rate is the same as is just one interest rate, it's equal to a marginal product of capital. So the first really important paper is Phelps, and he said, yes, an economy can over-accumulate capital, even if people are individually rational. And the criterion for knowing whether we have too much capital or not is a comparison of the interest rate, which is a unique one in this model, and the growth rate. If the interest rate is less than the growth rate, it basically means you have accumulated so much capital that marginal product is very low, the net marginal product is basically very low, and you would be better off just eating some of the capital. You'd have less output in the future, but you'd have more consumption because that part which you need to put aside to keep the same investment ratio, cover depreciation, would be smaller. So that was the golden rule result of Phelps. And then the next step was the result by Peter Diamond in NOLG, of the European model. He said, well, let me now construct a model in which people really can accumulate. So these individuals save rationally, but they may save too much. And if they save too much, R is going to be less than G. The economy is going to be dynamically inefficient. In this case, basically, it's good to issue debt, even if you do nothing with it. So no cost to debt at all. It's capital, because people are going to hold more debt, less capital in their portfolios. But that's good for the same reason as Phelps had given. And what you want to do here is basically issue more debt, and then again, you can just give the proceeds away or burn them, doesn't matter, until the interest rate, the marginal product, has increased back to G. That's a golden rule result. In this case, he showed, well, everybody's better off. You're better off today with some of the proceeds of the issuance of the debt. Future generations have higher consumption. So we teach this in our textbooks and say, well, in this case, it's probably not terribly relevant, but it's important to understand that an economy could oversave. Now, we are in a period in which R is less than G, but the issue is, as opposed to these models, we're acting, the world is uncertain and there are different rates. And in particular, you have the safe rate, which is less than G, but you have the average marginal product of capital, and this is definitely greater than G. So this is a graph which basically shows you a proxy for the average marginal product of capital for each year. I'm not going to go into why the two lines are different. There are issues of measurement, but the important point is that at no point marginal product of capital is less than 4% real. The growth rate over that period has never been above 4% real. It will be this year for special reasons, but in that sample, it didn't. So which way do you choose? Should you be looking at the safe rate? Should you be looking at the average marginal product of capital? So this led me to do quite a bit of work, and this was my presidential address, in which I basically to get at the answer. And I'm not going to go through it because it gets a bit technical. But basically, the answer is typically a safe rate plays an important role, and under some conditions, this is actually the rate you should be looking at. But in more general conditions, for example, I give the case of a Cobb-Douglas technology, then the right rate is what to compare to the growth rate and know how costly that is 1/2 of the safe rate. It's a weighted average of the safe rate and the average risky rate, the average marginal. So if you actually compute that, then you get a number which is not very different from G. So again, this slide could be and was a full lecture, but I think the bottom line, which I believe, despite the fact that all this is very abstract and theoretical, is that the cost of debt in terms of crowding out capital may not be very large. But our worry that debt is a catastrophe because it destroys capital and the future is terrible is probably not true. I don't think that we are on the wrong side of the golden rule. I don't think that is good per se, but I don't think that is very bad. I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about that. Okay, So let me now turn to the benefits of using debt or using deficits, which over time will build up to debt. And here, I think what is relevant, the previous slide was very much on the secular stagnation issue. This is very much on the effective lower bound issue, which is that when the rate is not only lower, the neutral rate is not only lower than the growth rate, but even lower than what monetary policy can achieve. And monetary policy cannot help anymore. And so if at the rate that monetary policy can achieve, you still have a large unemployment or large negative output gap, then fiscal policy is what is needed. So when you are at the ELB, then if your economy, private demand is weak, then you have to use deficits. There's nothing wrong with that. It has very large output welfare benefits, and at the same time, as we saw on the previous slide, it basically doesn't have a large cost in terms of the cost for future generations. Now here there's a whole debate, which I'm not going to go into, which is, well, fiscal policy work in pushing demand. So, there are all the discussions about the expansionary effects of fiscal austerity and so on. And again, if I had more time, I would argue that the evidence which has been largely accumulated since the global financial crisis says, the multipliers have the right sign. You can use fiscal policy to increase output, and deficit spending to increase output. And if you're going to go into fiscal austerity and reduce deficits, you may well create more unemployment, larger output. So I would put it together. Last point is, even if you go away from the ELB, so which is probably what's going to happen over the next few years, both in the Fed and the ECB, I don't know about Japan, still the room that you have to use monetary policy is very, very limited. And so in that case, fiscal policy may not have to intervene all the time, but it has to be ready to intervene in case monetary policy doesn't have enough role to play. So my conclusion is at the bottom, which is that, I think the welfare costs of debt are relatively small at this point, and the benefits of debt can be very substantial. If we're in the ELB, they are very large. Even if we're a bit away from the ELB, they remain very large. Okay, so I wonder where this is. This is the last slide. So question is, okay, so what policy should be today? So I think for the moment, we are in a situation in which there is secular stagnation, as I've said. I mean, R is a large negative number, and G is a large positive number. And the effective lower bound is strictly binding in the US, in the Eurozone, and in Japan, which are the three countries are focused on. We've had very large deficits due to both in 2020 and in 2021. What should we do? Well, as long as these two conditions hold, I think there is no question that we have to continue to run deficits and not start debt stabilization or debt reduction the way we did in the Eurozone in 2010, 2011. Monetary policy cannot help. If private demand is too weak, then we have to basically help the economy. It turns out that private demand will be strong enough, in which case, there is maybe a bit of space for reducing deficits and keeping output potential. If not, we have to be ready to do it. So we cannot just go on a path of increasing deficits no matter what. Well, hopefully we'll be able to do it in the future. So in the future, so I'm thinking here of the next 3 years, say, and I think aggregate demand is going to recover, private aggregate demand, which means that R star is going to increase. The effective lower bound is not going to be necessarily binding, but the secular stagnation condition will continue to hold. And so the question is, what do you do when the economy becomes a bit stronger? You can tighten fiscal a bit, or loosen monetary policy, or tighten monetary policy a bit. You can do one of two things. You can basically decide that you're going to, as private demand increases, you're going to offset this by decreasing deficits, and you're going to keep R star and by implication R and VLB. So basically the adjustment as aggregate demand becomes stronger is going to be due to take the form of fiscal austerity. Not very fast, but at the speed which is allowed by aggregate demand. Or you can do the reverse. The other extreme is that basically you continue to have large deficits, which is going to lead to an increase in R star, and then you basically increase the nominal rates by the central bank, so that R is equal to R star. So what should you do? Should you basically let the economy stay at very low rates and continue to have deficits, or reduce deficits? Reduce deficits and keep very low rates, decrease deficits and allow for higher rates. And I think that's going to be the issue over the next few years, which is, as aggregate demand increases, how are we going to basically relax monetary policy or tighten fiscal policy? What is going to be the right combination? And if I had a bit more time, I would tell you what I think should be done. But let me stop here, and enough time for